You used to be someone, Dad. Now you're just there. An insult rings out across the family dinner table, and no one objects. The chandelier glowed with a quiet cruelty above the mahogany table, casting soft golden light on cold expressions. The room was silent except for the clinking of utensils and orchestra of forced civility. Richard Hale sat at the end of the table, his plate untouched posture, straight hands folded. He had worn a blazer for the occasion, out of habit, not necessity. Susan's wineglass caught the light as she swirled it absently, the ruby liquid sloshing like unspoken judgment. Across from her, Madison Hale leaned back in her chair, one manicured hand resting on the armrest, like a queen presiding over a trial. Gary, her husband, offered no verdict, just a faint curl of the lips that resembled a smirk more than a smile. Redwood Tech is scaling again, Madison said casually, her tone sharp under the velvet. I advised them on moving their assets to energy-efficient funds. Got a call from their CFO this morning, wanted my take on restructuring their debt. Susan nodded with well-rehearsed interest. Smart girl. I always said you had the mind for high places. Richard watched quietly. The same table where he once explained compound interest to a 12-year-old Madison now served as a podium for his irrelevance. I remember Richard began his voice low, the letter I wrote to Columbia for your scholarship. Madison didn't look at him. That was years ago. Susan reached for the salad. We're not talking about the past, Richard. No one was. Every conversation ricocheted around him like he didn't exist until Madison's words cut through. You used to be someone, Dad. Now you're just there. No one flinched, not even Susan. Richard inhaled slowly through his nose. His fork remained untouched. The roast beef cooled on his plate as the warmth left his bones. I had a call with the lawyer today, Susan said, her tone clinical. We discussed some options. It's probably better if you stayed somewhere else for a while, just until things settle. Madison didn't bother hiding her laugh. Instead of teaching your son to invest, maybe learn to keep your dignity. The words didn't hit like a slap. They landed with the weight of inevitability. Gary raised his glass towards Susan. To changes. It was Susan's turn to smile, tight, victorious, hollow. Richard took his napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth, and stood. I see, he said. No bitterness, no anger. It's just an acceptance that no longer asked for anything. Not space, not affection, not even understanding. He walked out of the dining room, his footsteps muffled on the Persian rug. No one called after him. The air behind him remained thick with wealth and dismissal. Upstairs in the bedroom that still held his suits but none of his authority, Richard knelt beside the old walnut wardrobe. From beneath a stack of books, he pulled out a small black safe, unmarked, unimpressive. His fingers spun the dial with quiet precision, muscle memory born from years of practice. The lock clicked. Inside, cushioned by a faded velvet cloth, lay a silver USB drive. The label was handwritten, yellowed with age. Genesis Ledger, 2011. Richard stared at it for a moment, lips parting. A thin smile crossed his face. No one suspects the man they've already buried. Richard disappears from home, but not from the board. 3 days had passed since the dinner. Richard hadn't returned a single call, not that many were made. Susan likely assumed he was sulking in some hotel licking wounds she no longer believed existed. Madison probably imagined him drowning in irrelevance, and that suited him just fine. The landmark court building rose above the city like a granite sentinel. On the 12th floor, behind a frosted glass door marked J.H., Law and Advisory. Richard waited in a chair that still had the same creak as it did in 2013. Becca, James Harlow's longtime assistant, gave him a cautious smile as she passed over the tea. Her eyes lingered on him a little too long. I know I don't look like much these days, Richard offered with a dry smile. It's not that, Becca replied, soft but firm. People with money don't usually arrive without a briefcase or a plan. Richard lifted a worn leather folder from his coat. Oh, I have both. I just carry them quietly. The door to the inner office opened. James Harlow, leaner, now with more silver in his beard, but the same calculating gleam in his eye, extended a hand. Richard Hale. Either the apocalypse has begun, or you're finally cashing in that IOU. Richard stepped into the office, letting the door click shut behind him. The city spread below through paneled windows, but neither man looked out. James leaned back in his chair as Richard laid the USB drive on the table. "You remember this?" Richard asked. James nodded. "Genesis Ledger. You swore it was either brilliance or madness." "It was both," Richard said, opening the folder. "Here's the timeline. Wallets A through D. 4 cold storage chains, never touched, never traced. All bought in 2011 through decentralized platforms. Today's value," he paused. "Let James read the number, $1,487.312. Becca exhaled softly behind the glass wall. James tapped the paper. "These are untouched, every Satoshi, never moved." James whistled low. "You're either a ghost or the smartest man in Redwood Hills." "I just waited." The plan unfolded like a chess match. Richard wanted the assets transferred to a safety trust in Nevada, protected by legal structure, but with a unique condition: the funds could only be touched if Richard's name was publicly defamed in provable media channels. James raised an eyebrow. "So, if they tarnish your name, the money becomes active." Richard nodded. "Exactly." James chuckled. "That's poetic." Richard's face was impassive. "They think I'm a ghost. Let them. I'd rather haunt their conscience than beg for respect." As Becca re-entered with the notarized documents, she paused. "This clause," she said, pointing, "isn't it overkill?" James glanced at Richard. "Don't you need the money right now?" James asked. "I don't need the money," Richard replied. "I need them to know I was never helpless." The moment hung heavy. A checkmate whispered, "Not declared." They signed. A sharp ping broke the silence. James glanced at his laptop, then froze. "Richard." He turned the screen. An email forwarded anonymously, a screenshot attached. Post title: "How to Survive. Having a Useless Father." MadisonHale.blog. Timestamp that morning. Below it, a paragraph mocking tone. Private details: one particularly cruel sentence circled in red. "At some point you realize some people in your life are just liabilities wearing loafers." James looked up, eyes harder than before. "Richard, they didn't just insult you at dinner. They're publicly humiliating you. When someone draws blood in public, make sure your response is invisible until it isn't." The coffee shop on East Alder didn't look like much. Brick walls, chalkboard menus, quiet jazz piping in from dusty speakers. But Richard chose it for a reason. It was the kind of place where secrets passed hands without echo. He sat at the back corner table facing the entrance. A simple latte sat untouched before him, cooling in its cup. Across from him, Amy Reyes stirred her espresso with the same intensity she'd once used cross-examining fraud cases in 2010, before she nearly lost everything. Richard had helped her back then. Now she was about to return the favor. "This is damning," she whispered, eyes scanning the screen of the encrypted tablet. A folder labeled Verdant Strategies, Internal Rotation Records, blinked open. Inside were reports, timelines, and flagged transactions. Madison had routed stock through a shell company in the Caymans, artificially rotating ownership to simulate growth and inflate valuation on her so-called green tech revolution. Amy leaned back, the weight of it sinking in. If this hits the wire, she's done. Richard shook his head. "Not yet." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't want noise," he said. "I want erosion. Quiet, steady. Let it crack from the inside." He slid a printed sheet across the table. "Send this to the SEC's anonymous submission portal. No trace back to me. No rush either. Let it land when it counts." Amy nodded slowly, still playing the long game. "I never stopped." Outside, cars rumbled past on wet pavement. The sky had gone from gray to darker gray, like the color of unresolved consequences. Richard stood pocketing the USB. "I owe you a debt," Amy said. "No," Richard replied, adjusting his coat. "We're even. Maybe the world can be two, one move at a time." He stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was brisk, laced with distant rain and exhaust. As he passed a streetlight, a man brushed by him, too fast to be an accident, too slow to be threatening. A black envelope slid into his coat pocket like a whisper. Richard didn't flinch. He just kept walking. 2 blocks away, he opened it in a narrow alley behind an antique bookstore. Inside, a printed memo, unsigned, unmarked, except for one thing. A list of internal email chains from Verdant's leadership team hinting at insider trading discussions. He folded the paper back in two precise creases and tucked it into the inner lining of his wallet. Another thread, another shadow. By Thursday morning, Madison's public face had started to crack. The live stream began with the usual polished, perfect lighting, tasteful blazer bookshelf background curated for intellect. But by the third minute, her voice had wavered. I don't understand why the market reacted like this, she said, eyes shimmering. Comments flooded in, some sympathetic, most curious, a few brutal. Then the bloggers began to dig. Old posts surfaced. Her viral blog mocking her father appeared again, but this time it wasn't met with applause. It was questioned. The timing, the bitterness, the arrogance. Her following began to thin. By evening, the financial wires lit up with whispers. Verdant's valuation was under reassessment. Someone was reviewing shell activity. The scent of scandal hovered, no accusations yet, just suspicion. And that was enough. Richard watched it unfold from a quiet lounge on the West Side, drink in hand, TV on mute. The captions ran across the bottom of the screen like silent applause. Verdant down 12%. Market reacts to questionable structure in green tech portfolio. His phone buzzed. Susan. He let it ring once, twice, then picked up. Her voice was sharp, tinged with panic. Do you see what's going on? Madison's stock is down 12%. Richard looked out the window. The city shimmered under the weight of its own secrets. I only see one thing. Karma has a price. Before they beg for forgiveness, they must feel the consequences ripple through their empire. The lobby of Harlow Legal Group was all glass and silence. Richard stepped through the revolving doors just after 9:00 a.m. His presence quiet but unsettling, like a ripple on still water. James Harlow stood waiting near the elevators, already in a charcoal suit and holding a leather folio. Ready, he asked. Richard gave a nod. Let's see how deep the rot goes. By 10, they were seated in the central conference room of the Hale Family Foundation. Long mahogany tables, embroidered chairs, and portraits of benefactors lined the walls, Richard's own likeness among them, though slightly dustier than the others. Susan arrived first. She looked thinner, sharp-edged. Her heels echoed on the floor as she walked in, eyes narrowing, when she saw James seated beside Richard. I thought you were gone, she said coldly. I was, Richard replied. Now I'm present legally and otherwise. James opened the folio, sliding a single page forward. As of this moment, we are invoking Clause 9C of the Foundation's Articles of Incorporation. My client Richard Hale is requesting a full audit of share reallocations and trust structure revisions made since 2018, especially those concerning the Madison Hale Trust. Susan's eyebrows shot up. That's not your jurisdiction anymore. It is, James countered smoothly, because Richard never officially relinquished his co-founder status. The document claiming divestment is unsigned and invalid. Across the table, Andrew Hale, Richard's younger brother and current board member, shifted in his seat. He had always been silent during family disputes, but today the corner of his jaw tightened. Susan crossed her arms. Are you trying to destroy everything Madison built? Richard looked at her, voice calm. I just want to know what it's made of. Silence swept through the room like a cold wind. The meeting continued, clipped and cautious. James asked for transaction records, beneficiary updates, any redacted clauses involving offshore activity. Susan resisted, but legal footing favored them now. Andrew offered no help, his eyes fixed on the surface of his tablet. At 1:17 p.m., Madison burst through the doors, disheveled, breathless. I just got off a call with Verdant's legal team, she snapped. Why am I hearing about this from them? James didn't flinch. Perhaps because you've withheld documents. Would you like to see your trust deed? He slid another sheet forward, this one printed on heavier paper. Madison's eyes scanned it quickly, then froze. That's not... I didn't sign this. But someone did, James said. And the notary seal is missing. Her face paled. Susan stood. This is madness. Richard looked at them both. If the house shakes this easily, maybe it was never home. No one answered. The meeting disbanded in silence. That evening, on the drive back through the winding roads of Redwood Hills, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. SEC official notice. Investigation initiated. Verdant Strategies Inc. A second alert popped up. CNBC's mobile feed breaking SEC launches. Probe into prominent green tech portfolio. The market wouldn't ignore that. A final vibration. A message from Amy. Next step, full disclosure. Sometimes the one leaking your secrets sits at your dinner table every Sunday. The warehouse looked like it hadn't been used in years. Rust crept up the corrugated siding, and the roof sagged just enough to suggest it had seen better decades. Rain slashed across the cracked windows, tapping out a rhythm only the forgotten could hear. Richard parked 2 blocks away and walked in silence, his coat collar turned against the wind. Inside, a single bulb swung above a folding table, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He waited. At 7:42 p.m., the metal door creaked open. Nathaniel Hale stepped in, soaked and shivering, in a wrinkled button-down. He looked younger than 23 tonight, thin, nervous eyes darting like a man afraid of being followed. His sneakers squeaked on the floor. Richard said nothing. "I can't keep lying to you," Nathaniel said, breathless. "I used to admire you. I still do. But she made me sign things. Things I didn't understand at the time." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table like it burned his skin. It's all there. Fake contracts, transfer schemes, investor decks rewritten for markets they never entered. Richard watched him closely. "Why now? Because I see where this ends," Nathaniel whispered. "And I don't want my name on it." Richard picked up the drive, turned it over once, then nodded. "You were always smart. You just needed the right moment." "I'm not doing this for them," Nathaniel added quickly. "I'm doing this for you." Richard didn't smile, but his gaze softened, just barely. "Then stay silent. What you've given me, it's the last piece." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside is a document. James drew it up. "If anything happens to me, this gets delivered directly to the SEC with your name redacted." Nathaniel's fingers trembled as he took it. "You're really doing this?" "I'm not doing anything," Richard said. "I'm simply giving the truth a voice." Outside, the rain thickened. Later that night, Richard sat alone in his study. The lights dimmed, a single lamp illuminating the surface of his desk. He uploaded a copy of the flash drive's contents to a secure server, encrypted it, and submitted it through the same anonymous portal Amy had once used. But this time the file carried something more, a digital watermark that traced back to an internal document Madison had used just weeks ago. Not enough to reveal Nathaniel, but enough to mirror her own deception back at her. The next morning, the world turned upside down. Breaking: Hale Tech under investigation for securities fraud. FBI confirms federal summons for CEO Madison Hale. News outlets ran the footage of her being ushered through glass doors flanked by 2 agents in gray suits. She didn't speak. Her face, once confident, polished, now frozen in shock. The market recoiled. Stocks plummeted. Investors withdrew. By noon, Susan Hale stood outside Richard's home. Rain poured down, streaking her mascara, soaking through her blazer. She didn't knock at first, just stood there, eyes dark, mouth trembling, as if searching for a version of him she could still control. He opened the door before she could raise her hand. For a moment they stared at one another, not as husband and wife, not even adversaries. Just 2 people who had built something hollow and watched it collapse. "You did this?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Richard didn't answer. He simply turned, walked to the credenza, and placed a small wooden frame on the table. A family photo, one taken a decade ago, smiles worn and believable. But now beneath the glass lay a printed copy of Madison's forged trust deed, her signature stark against the truth. The thunder rumbled, but inside the silence roared louder. "You said I had achieved nothing? Let's tally the numbers, shall we?" The Hale Tech Tower had never looked colder. 10 stories of glass and steel gleaming beneath a cloudless sky. At 10:00 a.m., the main hall buzzed with camera shutters, murmurs, and executive whispers. The room usually reserved for polished quarterly presentations now felt more like a courtroom. Richard Hale walked in alone. No entourage, no legal team. Just a gray suit, a quiet presence, and a file in his hand. He took his seat near the center, facing the board. Behind them, the company's logo flickering slightly on the LED wall. The shareholders watched through a live internal feed. Press had been allowed, but only as observers. James Harlow sat discreetly in the second row. Susan sat farther back, silent hands clenched in her lap. The chairperson adjusted her microphone. Mr. Hale, as a founding shareholder, you've been invited to speak. Please proceed. Richard stood. In 2011, he began, I invested in digital infrastructure, green energy analytics, and compliance automation. Not for accolades, but because I believed in a better foundation. This company was built on trust, until trust was treated as optional. He clicked the remote. A projection appeared, internal ledgers side by side with tampered copies. Names blacked out, figures, altered dates, shifted just slightly enough to seem harmless. But the pattern was clear. Murmurs rose. Where did this come from? One executive asked, visibly pale. From someone inside, Richard said calmly, who finally remembered that truth has a higher return than silence. The doors creaked. Nathaniel walked in. Drenched in morning sweat, eyes hollow but steady, he carried a sealed envelope and a signed affidavit. I was there when she edited the fund transfer log, he said. We used a placeholder signature. I thought it was just a formality. Then I saw how deep it went. Gasps. Cameras flashed. The board turned toward Madison, who had arrived earlier, head-high, red lipstick bold. But her poise now slipped at the corners. She stood. This is personal. None of this had anything to do with my father. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he retrieved a final page from his folder. You once emailed Gary, he said quietly. Subject line, backup plan. Quote, if he ever finds out we used his old company ID to set up the Cayman Fund, we're screwed. Silence fell. Absolute. The board moved swiftly. A motion was called. A vote passed. Madison's executive privileges were suspended. The stock was frozen pending investigation. Richard remained standing. I'm not here for compensation, he said. I'm here to remove my name from the very liability reports used to shield this corruption. I don't need revenge. I need correction. He turned, left the file on the table, and walked away without waiting for applause or protest. The lobby overflowed with reporters and employees whispering behind phones and lattes. Susan chased after him. You don't want to go back. Richard stopped at the revolving door, the sunlight spilling in like a verdict. I never left. You're the one who walked away from us. He stepped forward, letting the door turn, leaving Susan alone in the noise. The boardroom fell behind me, but its silence echoed longer than any applause could. I wasn't proud of what it took to get here, but I was proud I didn't break. Not when they mocked me, not when they erased me. Sometimes justice comes dressed not in revenge, but in correction. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If you're ever told you've achieved nothing, look deeper. The quietest foundation often holds the heaviest weight.